Hello, friends, and welcome into Fantasy Pros. This is the Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm Chris Welsh, joined by Pat Fitzmaurice, Jacob Gibbs. This is Wide Receiver Ranks. We are going through all the wide receivers for this week, wide receiver 1s, 2s, and 3s with some big questions and hopefully answering some of yours. If you have got more questions that we don't hit on this episode, well, guess what? We've got lots of different avenues for you. One of those is going to fantasypros.com/rankings. Check it out throughout the entire week. They adjust. They might adjust as we're going into this episode because we've got close to 200 rankers that are putting in ranks all throughout the week. That is what adjusts and fix the ECR, the expert consensus ranks. Check those bad boys out if you've got any other questions. And no, we got a lot of offerings here for you. Gentlemen, let's talk and get right into these wide receiver ranks for week 10. Looking at the big board, number 1, Justin Jefferson, followed by Jamar Chase, Malik Neighbors, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Tyreek Hill. Pretty chalky top 5. Cooper Kupp comes in at 6, followed by Garrett Wilson, Puka Nacua, Deebo, A.J. Brown, Zay Flowers, and Drake London. ECR for Deebo Samuel is 9. Fitch, you've got him outside of wide receiver 1. Jacob, you have him at wide receiver 6. So Jacob, let's talk about the high man here. Deebo Samuel coming off of the bye. He's the number 1 in that offense. Hopefully everybody's healthy. Christian McCaffrey coming back. Maybe it doesn't really slightly take necessarily anything away. If anything, it might make them more efficient. But let's get your breakdown. Why is Deebo in that top 6 for you?
I do think that Christian McCaffrey coming back helps the offense overall, and the Niners do have the second highest implied point total this week. So I do think we're going to see a good game from them offensively. I think the bye came at exactly the right time for Deebo Samuel, and hopefully he will be healthier than we've seen him really since the beginning of the season. And then the big thing here is I just have to point out the per route data for Deebo Samuel with Brandon Ayuk off the field is absolutely absurd. So this is from 2022 to 2024. He's run 106 routes without Brandon Ayuk on the field. On those routes, he's averaged over 4 yards per route run. For reference on that, Tyreek Hill is the next highest player during that span at 3.2. Justin Jefferson is next at 2.8. Deebo's at 4.09 yards per route run without Brandon Ayuk on the field. His target per route run rate rises to 36%. Without Brandon Ayuk on the field, gets a little bit more downfield involvement, and then just overall the offense is funneled through him. Meanwhile, George Kittle's rates have been basically the same. They've risen a little bit without Ayuk on the field, but I think George Kittle has been more sensitive to Deebo's presence, which I think makes sense because of the vicinity which those players draw their targets is a little bit more similar, whereas Deebo's been able to get a little bit more involved down the field as a route runner and the first read target for the team. On that note, in the first game without Ayuk, it was a big game for Kittle and not so much for Deebo. But the underlying data suggests that more big things could be coming. It was a 41% first read target rate for Deebo Samuel. That's per fantasy points data. So 41% of Brock Purdy's first read targets went to Deebo Samuel in that game. 35% for Kittle. So still really good for him. He's a tight end 1. But I think people really sleep on Deebo. And we're going to get to Jaylen Waddle lately. It's kind of a what have you done for me lately type of game that we play here. Don't forget how good Deebo Samuel is. That's kind of where I'll leave it.
You know, I'll agree. The Homer 49ers stuff behind me. One thing I want to add, though, and this is not necessarily a counter to because I agree with everything, but something I've been beating the drum about that you do have to consider is Jauan Jennings. And when Jauan Jennings was in earlier this year, Jauan Jennings ended up playing that Brandon Ayuk role early in the year. He was the deep threat guy that Brock Purdy loved to go to. We have not had Jauan Jennings. He is back in practice. Looks like he's going to play. I don't really think that has to take away from Deebo Samuel, but just this is maybe that reminder that Jauan Jennings might be that play as he comes back. Pat, I don't imagine that Jauan Jennings is a reason that you're putting Deebo Samuel outside of the top 12, but you have actually been pretty high on Deebo, I feel like, for some of the year. But what is your take where he is outside of the wide receiver 1 range for you?
I have been mostly high on him, but Deebo is always such a hard player for me to rank because his target counts are all over the place. His involvement as a runner can be inconsistent. I feel like sometimes I'm leaning on vibes way more for Deebo Samuel than I'd like to, rather than any hard data we can sink our teeth into. But I try not to have take lock, and Jacob just provided some incredibly interesting hard data that has me wanting to move up Deebo in the rankings because over 4 yards per target or per route run that is an insane number. And that's not a small sample size. That's over 100 routes that we have with Deebo playing without Ayuk on the field. So I didn't want to fall into the trap of thinking that Ayuk's absence would automatically make Deebo a smash play. But boy, that's a compelling reason to think he might indeed be a smash play. So yeah, I mean, I do have a hard time ranking him inside the top 12 when I know that the distribution of touches is also going to include Christian McCaffrey, George Kittle, Jauan Jennings. But man, when I hear about those numbers and what Deebo has done without Ayuk so far, I think I'm probably going to have to move him into wide receiver 1 range.
Yeah, and I'm going to be inside the top 10 for Deebo Samuel. One other thing to consider, not that anybody's really considering like not playing him again. These are wide receiver 1s. But one thing is Deebo has done a really good job in his career of playing off of that like short pass screen game. And I feel like that's kind of been gone this year. Christian McCaffrey makes that so much better, where you can roll McCaffrey on one side, screen pass Deebo on the other side. McCaffrey changes defensive looks, and you could get like old traditional, we're going to just throw that screen pass to Deebo 3 or 4 times a game and see what he can end up doing with it, because they've also got better deep threat options with Jennings back and Kittle. Just a thing to think about that, like, I know this is semantics about a wide receiver 1, but I lean with Jacob here that I really do think that Deebo has a chance to smash more than anything, even though they're bringing such a big fantasy option back to the team. And like I think we already have the answer here, Pat. You have Puka over Deebo, correct?
I do.
Jacob, Deebo over Puka?
Yeah, and honestly, I'm considering moving him above Jamar Chase. We'll get to him later in the tight end discussion, but the splits with T. Higgins off the field are pretty crazy.
Yeah, you know me. I'm like, do it. Let's just go for it. All right, let's jump into the wide receiver 2. There's only one guy to talk about in the wide receiver 1 range. You guys know what to do with those. 13 through 24, Devontae Adams comes in at 13. Devonta Smith, Terry McLaurin, George Pickens, CD Lamb is pushed down there. That's definitely people just hedging. Brian Thomas, Tank Dell. Number 20 is Darnell Mooney. Josh Downs at 21, Lad McConkey, DeAndre Hopkins, and Khalil Shakir. That is the matchup. By the way, 21 wide receivers are given the A+ start and sit rating. That's a lot. And because we grade them out, you can go and look on the fantasy ranks page. You get the matchup rating overall, and then if it's an A or B, 21 wide receivers with at least an A- or higher. And guess what? Number 21 is Josh Downs, guy that we're going to talk about here. Josh Downs, it was a disappointment last week in the Joe Flacco taking over for Anthony Richardson world, because expectations were absolutely sky high for Josh Downs, because he was going to, now he still was like the guy for Joe Flacco, but Flacco struggled. Pass rush destroyed him. He had no ability to get away. I mean, he had 1.4 seconds to throw the ball, it seemed like, every single time. But in turn, it ended up affecting Josh Downs. And I think maybe even like a buy low situation. Fitz, you are lower than consensus. Jacob, you are higher. So this would be a good conversation. But Fitz, let's start with you. You do have Downs still in the wide receiver 2 territory, but looks like he is just holding on. Do you think Joe Flacco is going to get back to that Joe Flacco we saw earlier, where everyone was like, please get him in the lineup to make Josh Downs, the guy?
Good question. I'm less optimistic about Joe Flacco than most people, I think. Mm-hmm. And man, it's funny. I had a poor week ranking wide receivers last week, and that was with me sort of fading Josh Downs. And maybe if he had smashed the way some people were expecting him to, I really would have been in the basement with my wide receiver rankings. Downs does seem to have passed Michael Pittman Jr. as the primary target, the Colts' lead receiver. He's up against the Bills this week, and yes, it is easier to attack the Bills from the slot than it is with your outside receivers, who the Bills have been pretty much blanketing this season. I just want to see more from Downs. I want to see more touchdowns. I want to see more big yardage games. I'm just not ready to rank him as a set it and forget it top 20 wide receiver every week. I'm getting closer, because those weekly target totals have been pretty consistent when he is playing with Joe Flacco. And honestly, even when he was playing with Anthony Richardson at the end there, it seemed like Downs had become the lead receiver for the Colts. So I'm warming up, but I'm not quite ready to meet ECR just yet.
Jacob, you are beating ECR. You've got him at 17. Was last week a little bit more of an outlier than anything else, not just with Flacco, but with Josh Downs?
Yeah, I mean, the Colts ran the fewest plays of any offense last week. You could call it an outlier. And even still, 12 PPR points, that's not bad at a wide receiver position that has been pretty barren this year. That's his lowest total in 4 games with Flacco. The other ones, he had 20, 16, and 20 PPR points. I think Josh Downs is an insanely good player and fun player. He's maybe my favorite receiver in the NFL, so I am a little bit biased, but the numbers back it up. This is on a per route basis, and it's important to note that he's only running about 2/3 of the routes because he only plays in 3 receiver sets. But I think we'll see a lot of 3 receiver sets if the Colts are losing, which they're expected to be losing against the Bills here. But on a per route basis, Josh Downs, when Anthony Richardson's not on the field, is wide receiver 1 in targets per out run, wide receiver 1 in first downs per out run, wide receiver 6 in yards per out run, wide receiver 2 in PPR points per out run. He's really, really, really good. And that's with one play where it looked to me like he scored a touchdown and he got called back. If he had that, he'd probably be wide receiver 1 in PPR points per out run. The matchup is there. I will say, the Colts are only applied for 21 points this week. So the only teams with a lower implied total are the Panthers, Cowboys, Broncos, Patriots, and Titans. So Vegas is kind of on Pat's side here with a little bit of hesitancy about what we've seen with Joe Flacco. So keep that in mind, just a little cold water to temper expectations with all the goodness that I threw out about Josh Downs.
One thing I'll say too is when we look at the ranks, I feel like I'm always interested in where that line is oh, this is where the questions start, because obviously we're in wide receiver 1s and 2s, and there's not a ton of real are you going to sit Terry McLaurin unless you play in a 2 wide receiver 10-man league and you've got amazing options? But I think the real questions start right around 20. Darnell Mooney's at 20. I love Darnell Mooney right now. 52% first read percentage from last week. Ridiculous. Mm-hmm. But I feel like the questions start here. And one, I just want to ask you guys, because I'm not looking at your physical ranks here. DeAndre Hopkins went off last week and really looks to be in favor with the Chiefs. DeAndre Hopkins or Josh Downs? Jacob, let's start with you for this week.
I have Downs higher because I think he is a little bit safer. His median projection is much higher than Hopkins. But if you're looking only for upside, I'm glad you brought this up, because there's the receivers who immediately follow Downs in my rankings are George Pickens, Darnell Mooney, Tank Dell, Jaylen Waddle, DeAndre Hopkins, Marvin Harrison Jr., Brian Thomas Jr. Basically, all of those guys have a much higher ceiling projection than Downs. Mooney is the one guy who's about the same in terms of their range of outcomes. All the other guys are much more boom bust players with a really high ceiling. So it's kind of what type of profile are you looking for? If you want more of a boom bust guy, I think Hopkins definitely makes sense over Downs.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's actually something that comes up. We are just, we're littered with questions throughout the entire week. And sometimes the only context we can't answer with someone is are you looking for upside? Or are you looking for safety? Because sometimes there really is a real thing about just having a safety net of points. That does play a role, and it might play a role into this range. But and you can comment on that. But DeAndre Hopkins or Josh Downs this week?
Yeah, I do have Hopkins ranked higher, but Jacob does make a good point. If I were playing in a 10-team PPR league and I actually had to make that choice, maybe if I was a 10-point favorite, I'd go toward Downs, even though I have Hopkins ranked higher, because I do think that target and catch floor is safer, but I'm pretty much in on Hopkins. 9 targets, 8 catches, 86 yards, 2 touchdowns against the Buccaneers on Monday night. And it seems like Hopkins has already established himself as the number 1 receiver on the Chiefs. And that connection with Patrick Mahomes is only going to get stronger. I realize the Broncos this week are kind of a difficult matchup, and maybe Hopkins does see some of Patrick Surtain Jr. I still want to be bullish on Hopkins, though.
All right, I'm going to throw a curveball at you. This is one, by the way, I asked that DeAndre Hopkins question, not even realizing on our sheet we had DeAndre Hopkins here. I'm going to throw one more little curveball.
Nice segue.
Yeah, it was a natural segue that I just did, and I wasn't even looking. I'm going to throw, this is the curveball here because it's not prepared. So we'll go to Pat first. And I'm going to do kind of the same thing because, like I said, I think this is a really good range where I feel like a lot of questions are going to be centered around this wide receiver 20s to 24s. In this same range, Darnell Mooney or Khalil Shakir for this week? And do you think if whichever one you pick, do you think there is a tier difference? Mooney is at 20. Shakir is at 24. Shakir has been a dominant force, especially with Amari Cooper out, Keon Coleman banged up. Shakir is given a better overall matchup, a 4-star rating versus Darnell Mooney's 3-star rating. So Pat, Darnell Mooney or Khalil Shakir?
So the health of what maybe we should consider to be the lead receivers for each team makes a difference, because I think there's probably a better chance Amari Cooper plays this week than there is of Drake London playing this week. But say Drake London were to play and Amari Cooper were to not play, then I would put Shakir over Darnell Mooney. But as of now, I would play Mooney, and I think he's probably a tier higher for me.
Okay, so that's good. I wanted to know the tier higher. Jacob, Same question. Khalil, Shakir, Darnell Mooney. You did tell us, I think you said Darnell Mooney, it's like 18, like somewhere right in that range. I didn't hear you say Shakir. So if it is Mooney, is this like a tier above Shakir?
I think they're basically the same tier. Shakir's at the bottom of the tier. I was a little bit disappointed to see Shakir's role scaled back, but the Bills seem insistent on doing that to him over and over and over, even though he's been one of the most productive receivers in the NFL. He was third on the team in routes run last week. I like to target Shakir when the Bills are playing defenses that play a lot of too high safety looks, so they can just pepper him with underneath stuff, and that's not what we're seeing against the Colts. They use a ton of cover 3, which is a single high safety zone coverage that typically leads to a lot of targets to the perimeter receivers.
Okay, love it. Wide receiver 2, some big questions in there. Maybe you love Josh Downs. Maybe you love Darnell Mooney. You've done the fantasy analysis. You know you've got your own projections. You're set. You're like, he's going to eat at receptions or yards or touchdowns. Well, guess what? You can take that fantasy knowledge and you can make some money with it. And right now, with our company, Betting Pros, we are offering a 1-month BP premium subscription right now, and you can unlock it by using promo code FPFREE. Get access to the tools like our same game parlay tool, the prop bet analyzer, which you can take some of these individual player projections. You can go and put it in the analyzer and you can get all the data completely unlocked. Plus, we got the prize pick prop bet cheat sheet. Don't miss out. Try it for free for 1 month. 1 month of full access to BP Premium. It's available on iOS and Android. Use that promo code FPFREE. Wide receivers 25 through 36. These are our wide receiver 3. Starts with Marvin Harrison Jr., Calvin Ridley, DJ Moore, Cortland Sutton, Jordan Addison, Jaylen Waddle. Put a pin in that Jaylen Waddle one right there at 30. Rome Odunze, Amari Cooper, Jauan Jennings, who I mentioned at 33. Jamison Williams is back. Xavier Legette and Michael Pittman at 36. Okie doke. Let's jump into Jaylen Waddle. That was our tease for earlier in the show. This is, I joked with Pat before the show. I said I needed the graphics team to put a graphic of me and Erickson on the sinking Titanic as the band that refuses to get off. Like me and him have just been, buy all the guy. I think Achane was a win, by the way. We were right about buying Achane on the cheap. If you got the Tyreek Hill was what I was beating the drum about early on. It hasn't been great, but still good. Jaylen Waddle has not worked. It has been bad, and this past week was not great. Wide receiver 30, this is an absolute breaking point for people after the last 2 weeks with Tua that he has not done well. Fitz, you've got him at 28, actually a little bit higher than ECR. Oh, but Mr. Jacob Gibbs, you got him at 21, baby. You got him as a wide receiver 2. So please, wax poetically on Jaylen Waddle and how this is going to bounce back.
Yeah, I'm right there on the ship with you. And my listeners at FFT have been really frustrated. People are talking about dropping Jaylen Waddle and everything. Let's zoom out a little bit. I know we live in a what have you done for me lately world here in the fantasy football space, but let's zoom out for a little bit and remember who we are talking about. We are talking about the wide receiver with the highest career yard per route run rate at the collegiate level of any wide receiver drafted over the past 5 years. So that's higher than the legendary Puka Nacua or Jackson Smith and Jigba rates. That's higher than Devontae Smith. Some consider him the best collegiate wide receiver of all time. Higher than CeeDee Lamb, higher than Jamar Chase. Awesome collegiate players. Number 1, Jaylen Waddle. He was then drafted 6th overall. Gave us 1,000 yards as a rookie. He's never had a season with fewer than 1,000 yards. It's now 2024, and he's on pace for 660 yards. And people are freaking out, which, I mean, it makes sense. It's been really frustrating, but I do think it's important to first remember who we're talking about here. It's easy to lose sight of who the player is when we're microanalyzing things. He's played 8 games, 4 without Tua. The Dolphins were, I think, really the least functional offense that we've seen for an extended period of time of any team this year during that time. So I'm honestly ready to throw those games completely out. even in the 4 games with Tua, it has not been good, and people are really frustrated, and I get that. So now we're going to zoom in on those 4 games. 2 of those 4 games came against the Bills. 1 was against the Cardinals. Those are really unique matchups. Arizona's opponent first read target rate is only 63%. That's by far the lowest in the NFL. The next lowest is 67%. The league average is 72%. This is per fantasy points data. So the Cardinals don't allow offenses to do what they would like to do. The Cardinals dictate what offenses do. They invite offenses to target running backs. They invite offenses to target tight ends and beat them with short plays, runs, and short passes. The Cardinals stack the box at the lowest rate in the NFL. They really are just like a hands-off defense. The Bills literally have the highest opponent running back target rate in the NFL and the lowest opponent wide receiver target rate in the NFL. This is Sean McDermott's defense. This is what we've seen for a long time. In 2023, they had the 3rd lowest opponent wide receiver target rate in the NFL, the 6th lowest opponent first read target rate for the Bills defenses. So these are 2 defenses that are not normal matchups, and they make up 75% of the sample size for Jaylen Waddle with Tua in 2024. In the other game, Waddle went for 109 yards. I think it's entirely possible that we are like dramatically overreacting to a small sample size here. 4 games, 8 games is minuscule in the grand scheme of things. We have so much more data that suggests that Waddle is like really a spectacular player. What can we expect this week? I certainly don't know. Like the Dolphins have been all over the place, but like what I do know is the Rams have the 4th highest opponent wide receiver target rate. So it's much different than the defenses we just talked about. The other thing is this game has the highest over-under of any being played in Week 10. So Vegas is expecting a shootout. And we just saw the Rams secondary look really easy to pick on. Jackson Smith and Jigba could have had 250 yards if not for penalties against this defense last week. And really on top of that, there's a whole lot of schematic notes I could give you. I do think specifically for Jaylen Waddle, this matchup sets really well, but we have a bunch of players to discuss today. So for the sake of brevity, which is hilarious to say after talking for 3 minutes about this, I'll just say Google FFT newsletter or Google Jacob Gibbs newsletter, and you'll find my free newsletter to write. Every Wednesday, Thursday, I do advanced matchups, and I'll, of course, be focused on Jaylen Waddle this week.
You know, one of the things I would throw out, Pat, on the Jaylen, because like I want to believe, because I kind of agree with the totality of what Jacob's saying in that, like, you know, we are hyper focused on like a very, very small sample size of being like, oh, well, he's just washed and done when it has traditionally been really good. My only problem with this in general has been offensive scheme with the Dolphins looks off this year. Like I don't know how many games you watch where you're like, okay, Dolphins, and then it's just run. They're running more. It looks like they feel less comfortable throwing the ball deep, even though they've got, you know, such one of the best deep ball players probably in NFL history in Tyreek Hill. Like it feels from an offensive scheme standpoint that something is off. And I think that's the thing that's sticking in my craw a little bit more than like Jaylen Waddle is not good. Pat, you've got him about ECR, maybe slightly higher. He's like a mid flex to you. What do you want to add or what do you want to throw in about Jaylen Waddle?
Well, I mean, if getting the ball into the hands of Devon Achane means the offense looks off, Welsh, if that's wrong, I don't want to be right.
Okay, yeah, I agree with what you're saying, but you know what I'm getting at. Like, Achane should get the ball 4 million times, but I'm saying it's just run, short passes. Like, what happened to that Dolphins team that was slinging the ball and huge plays and Waddle's getting 10 catches down the middle? That team isn't here this year.
I hear you, but we do have to expunge all data where we had either Skylar Thompson or Tyler Huntley at quarterback for the Dolphins. So like drilling down on the Tua thing, and Jacob makes the point that those a couple of those matchups that Tua and Waddle have not been ideal for outside wide receivers. So to me, it's just if Tua is healthy, you are starting Waddle unless the matchup is exceptionally putrid. And that is certainly not the case with the Rams, as Jacob pointed out. You know, they've given up the 8th most fantasy points to wide receivers. So by all means, lean into Jaylen Waddle this week. And how great is it that last week, 1 minute there was concern that Waddle had just torn his Achilles, and the next minute he is catching his first touchdown pass of the season.
saving the day too. Interesting. You say you are playing him. One name that might kind of throw people off as a guy that could end up being started over him in some instances is the guy we mentioned earlier, Jauan Jennings. I threw Jauan Jennings out. We didn't really sit and talk about him. He's ECR 33. Fitz, you do have him at 30, so you've got him right there. Let me save the Jacob ranking here. We'll do that here in a second. But what do you want to throw out about Jennings? Do you think Jennings is in the same territory as Waddle?
I do. I mean, I'd prefer to start Waddle, but like Jennings, what we've seen so far has been good. He obviously had that one smash game where everyone was expecting, Ayuk to go off when Deebo was out of the lineup, and it was Jauan Jennings' day, 175 yards, 3 touchdowns. So far, Jennings has only drawn 36 targets this season, but he's averaging 11.2 yards per target, 2.75 yards per route run, has an average depth of target of 12.3 yards. So Jennings is going to be the primary downfield receiver for Brock Purdy, who, by the way, has been cooking. I feel pretty good about starting Jennings this week.
As do I, and as does Jacob, because this is where the fun rank is. Jacob, you were talking a ton about Deebo, but what got buried when I gave my little thing about Jauan Jennings was also your rank. You've got him at 16. So you've got essentially him taking over that Ayuk role. And that's kind of what I talked about when the Ayuk injury went down, is like, there's a legitimate chance that Deebo goes back into his role and that Jauan Jennings takes over that Ayuk role. So what else do you want to add? Because you didn't get to really talk about Jennings.
Yeah, only 3 wide receivers are averaging more yards per out run than Jauan Jennings this year. Nico Collins, AJ Brown, Justin Jefferson. Even if you take away that insane game against the Rams, he's still averaging over 2 yards per out run on the year. He's been really, really good all year, not just one game. If you look at his career without Brandon Ayuk on the field, he's averaging 2.8 yards per out run. That's exactly what he's averaging this year. And only, I think, 15 of those routes came this year. So it's not like his phenomenal play this year is really influencing that data that I just gave for his career. I think it's possible that he's a really good player who's just been kind of hidden because the Niners have a lot of really good players. Anytime that they've needed him to make plays, third and Jauan has come up big for them. And now they really do need him. And I think he might just keep coming up big. We'll see how healthy he is. But if he's healthy, everything looks good for San Fran this week. They're playing a Bucs team that offenses have chosen to pass against. I brought up pass rate over expectation earlier in reference to like run heavy defenses. The Bucs, I think, have the fifth highest opponent pass rate over expectation. So all things equal, teams choose to pass even when maybe think they would be expected to run. And so I do think we'll see a potentially huge game for Jauan here. I'm curious how Ricky Pearsall will affect things. Do you have any takes on how much he'll play or be involved here?
I don't think he's playable for fantasy. Like I think, the third receiver for the 49ers tends to be less valuable than on other teams just because they like to play Kyle Juszczyk so much.
Mm-hmm.
And Christian McCaffrey and Kittle. I mean, he is at best the 5th option on that team. Possibilities, through wide receiver sets, there's definitely possibilities that he could do a little something, but not being playable, I think, is the most important thing.
For what it's worth, Fantasy Points Data's average separation score has Jauan Jennings as the clear wide receiver 2 behind Ayuk, well ahead of Deebo Samuel, and he's been much, much better as a downfield route runner than Deebo Samuel too. I do think it makes sense that he'll kind of step into that Ayuk role if anybody's going to.
Yes.
2 last ones. Let's do some quick hitters here. Xavier Legette, wide receiver 35. Jacob, you have got him at 33. Fitz, he is outside of the top 36 wide receivers for you. Fitz, let's get a take on Xavier Legette.
Yeah, I mean, he scored touchdowns in 3 of his last 4 games, and he is just a beast after the catch. Like, I love what a physical marvel he is and has the ball in his hands. I don't think he's a very polished route runner. And I do wonder if we do see Adam Thielen back in Germany this week. And if we do see Adam Thielen back, if Bryce Young goes back to leaning on Adam Thielen the way he did for much of his rookie season, because Adam Thielen is a polished route runner, whereas Xavier Legette really is not.
Yeah, you'd almost wonder, too, long-term, if they say, we're going to do you a favor and release you so you can go do something with a team that can do something, because that's the problem, is backing any Panther. Jacob, anything you want to add with Legette?
He had his highest first read target rate of his career last week. So that's good to see him show some ability to draw targets and be trusted as the top target in the offense. The other thing I'll throw out is the Giants defense really struggled to get pressure last week. They blitzed 60% of the time against Washington and only got pressure 20% of the time. So that is weird. I think their defense maybe has taken a step back as the year has gone on. And Bryce has been playing pretty well, surprisingly well. So I think you can feel cautiously optimistic about Legette here.
The last one, we're going to do an outside the top 36. It is a price check. Quentin Johnston, price check, ECR 39. Fitz, you've got him at 36. Jacob, you have him at 51. This is a big discrepancy. Jacob, you are like my dear friend Scott Bogman, where he sees Quentin Johnston do something and he goes, I don't believe you. That's pretty much every single time he doesn't trust it. Do you not trust it, Jacob?
Yeah, I hate to say it. I'm not trying to hate on the guy, but I think he's been the luckiest player, or at least the luckiest wide receiver in the NFL this year. He had 66 yards and a touchdown on a broken play. He had 26 yards on the last play of the game versus prevent defense where they're trying lateral stuff. So that's 17 PPR points on two really random plays. He only had a 68% route rate. So it's not like he's a full-time player yet. I think the offense really runs through Ladd McConkey. The good news is the Chargers are throwing a lot more. And so, maybe he does have a decent game, but I'm not taking what we saw last week. I'm taking it with a big grain of salt.
Fitzy, you got him as a starter in the wide receiver 3. You have him at 36.
Yeah, I mean, Johnston has not seen more than 6 targets in any game this season, but and as Jacob mentioned, some of his yardage has been a little bit hokey, so maybe we should take his 15.7 yards per catch and 10.4 yards per target with a grain of salt. But what I do find encouraging, after catching 56.7% of his targets last year, he's up to 66.7 this year. We have not seen the paddle hands that we saw last year, the frying pan hands. Like, he's actually bringing the ball in, and the real appeal, big plays, 4 touchdowns in 6 games, and he is athletic and a big, dangerous man with the ball in his hands.
Well, if you got more questions on the wide receiver ranks, don't forget to check out our weekly Start and Sit live stream on the YouTube channel right here, where you can come and ask your specific Start and Sit questions every Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And for those on the podcast, youtube.com/FantasyPros, subscribe, click the bell, and get in on all the action for the live streams. For Pat and Jacob, I'm Welsh. That's your wide receiver ranks for week 10.